Before you keep watching, smash that like button right now. This video is about to expose a sitting district attorney who thought the law didn't apply to him. Prove to YouTube's algorithm that you care about justice. Hit that like button and tell us in the comments, which country are you watching from? We've got viewers from all over the world. Let us know where you're tuning in. Now, let's begin. The television courtroom had never witnessed a man so powerful walk in so confident and walk out so completely destroyed. For 30 years, District Attorney Richard Hammond had been untouchable. He was the kind of man who had federal judges save him seats at charity dinners, the kind of man whose phone calls were returned within minutes by senators, the kind of man who walked into any room in his state and watched people straighten their ties and lower their voices. At 58 years old, with his silver hair perfectly combed, his $4,000 Navy Brioni suit pressed to military sharpness, and a solid gold Rolex Submariner glinting on his wrist, Richard Hammond believed with every fiber of his being that he was about to school a television judge on national television. His black Lincoln Navigator pulled up to the studio that morning with a two-vehicle motorcade. Two aides carried his briefcase. A third walked behind him with his coffee. He didn't acknowledge the producer who greeted him at the door. He didn't shake hands with the makeup artist. He told his lawyer just loud enough for everyone backstage to hear, "I've prosecuted murderers. I'll bury this old woman in 5 minutes." He had no idea that within 23 minutes, he would lose everything: his career, his marriage, his reputation, his freedom, and eventually his name. Because what Richard Hammond didn't know was that Judge Faith had been quietly building a case against him for 6 months. 6 months of private phone calls, 6 months of sealed depositions taken at her own kitchen table, 6 months of one very nervous court clerk and one retired detective, and one heartbroken mother waiting for the right moment to finally tell the truth. And that moment had arrived. Hammond walked into that courtroom believing he was the most dangerous man in the room. He had no idea he was walking into the most carefully laid trap in courtroom television history. The case looked simple on paper. A 64-year-old retired school teacher named Eleanor Martinez was suing Hammond personally for $50,000, funeral costs, and legal fees from 12 years of failed appeals for her son. It was supposed to be easy. Hammond's lawyers had told him to settle. He had refused. He wanted the cameras. He wanted the platform. He was being vetted for a federal judgeship, okay? And his ego whispered that destroying a grieving mother on national television would be the perfect audition tape. So he walked into Judge Faith's courtroom that Tuesday morning with a smirk on his face and contempt in his eyes. And then exactly 17 minutes into the hearing, Richard Hammond did something no sitting district attorney ever done before on camera. He pointed his finger directly at Judge Faith and said the 7 words that would end his career. "You should be very careful, Judge Faith." The courtroom went silent. The kind of silence that doesn't happen in television. The kind of silence where you can hear the cameras humming and the audience holding its breath. Hammond's own attorney closed his eyes. Eleanor Martinez covered her mouth. The bailiff took an involuntary step forward, and Judge Faith, 82 years old, 56 years on the bench, the woman who had stared down murderers in courtrooms across America before Richard Hammond had ever passed his bar exam, didn't blink. She didn't move. She just looked at him for 8 long seconds. And then she said the single sentence, just 12 words long, that would trigger a federal investigation, bankrupt his family, end his 30-year career, expose 18 years of buried evidence, and free 47 wrongfully convicted men. What followed became the most viral courtroom moment in daytime television history. 94 million views in 11 days, trending #1 on every platform for 11 consecutive days. The hashtag Faith Destroys Day was used in over 6 million posts before the week was out. Veterans groups, the Innocence Project, civil rights organizations, 3 former federal judges, and 1 sitting U.S. senator all released statements within 48 hours. The clip was studied in 14 law schools within a year. And Richard Hammond, the man with the gold Rolex and the motorcade and the federal judgeship nomination, would be sitting in a federal prison cell wearing the same beige uniform as the men he had spent 30 years putting away. Before we get into the most explosive courtroom confrontation in daytime TV history, subscribe and turn on the bell right now. Don't miss the moment when arrogance finally meets accountability. Judge Faith is about to reveal hidden crimes that will leave you absolutely speechless. To understand why a sitting district attorney walked into Judge Faith's courtroom that morning believing he was completely untouchable, to understand the kind of man Richard Hammond truly was and what he had done to the woman sitting trembling across from him, you need to know what really brought him there. And the story begins 12 years ago in a small apartment on the east side of town with a 19-year-old college freshman named Daniel Martinez. Eleanor Martinez, Ellie, as her grandchildren had called her before she had any grandchildren left to call her that, sat in the plaintiff's chair at 8:47 that Tuesday morning, 43 minutes before the cameras would roll. She was 64 years old. She was wearing the same gray cardigan she had worn to her son's funeral 18 months earlier because she couldn't afford a new one and because somehow it made her feel closer to him. Her hands would not stop trembling. In her lap sat a manila folder, soft and creased at the corners from being opened and closed 1,000 times over 12 years. Inside that folder were letters. Letters from her son written from prison. Letters from lawyers who had taken her retainer and then stopped returning her calls. Letters from the parole board. Letters from the warden. And one letter she had only discovered 18 months ago. The letter that had brought her here. The letter that had changed everything. Ellie didn't want to be on television. She had never watched a daytime court show in her life. She had taught 4th grade in a public elementary school for 38 years, and the loudest she had ever spoken in public was reading Charlotte's Web aloud to a room of 9-year-olds. But she had run out of doors to knock on, and Judge Faith was the last one left. Her son Daniel had been 19 years old when they arrested him, a college freshman, the first member of the Martinez family to go to college on a full academic scholarship to the state university, studying mechanical engineering because he wanted to design wheelchairs for veterans. He had been working a part-time shift at a convenience store the night the robbery happened, except he had clocked out 40 minutes before the suspect walked in. The security footage was grainy. The suspect was the same height and build as Daniel. The store owner, in shock, identified him from a photo lineup. And District Attorney Richard Hammond, who was up for re-election that fall and needed a fast conviction for his Tough on Crime campaign, made sure the trial moved quickly. The public defender assigned to Daniel had 47 other cases that month. He met Daniel for the first time 3 days before the trial. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Daniel was sentenced to 25 years. He served 12 of them. He died in the prison infirmary on a Thursday morning in October, 18 months before Ellie sat in that courtroom. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac complications. What it really was, what the records would later show, was an untreated infection from a routine appendectomy. It's a problem that had been documented in his medical file for 3 months. The prison had denied him surgery 4 times because the procedure was classified as non-emergency. He was 31 years old when he died. He had spent more than a third of his life in a cell for a crime he didn't commit. 2 weeks after the funeral, Ellie had finally found the strength to go through the cardboard box of his belongings the prison had mailed to her. At the bottom of the box, underneath a stack of legal pads and a paperback copy of The Count of Monte Cristo that he had read 7 times, she found an envelope. Inside that envelope was a single sheet of paper, a sworn affidavit, notarized and dated 3 weeks before Daniel's trial. It was from the store owner, the same man who had identified Daniel from the photo lineup. The affidavit said in 3 short paragraphs that he had been wrong, that after seeing a clearer photograph, he was certain the man in the security footage was not Daniel Martinez. The affidavit had been delivered to the district attorney's office. It had a stamped receipt from Richard Hammond's office dated 14 days before Daniel's trial began. The defense had never seen it. It had never been entered into evidence. It had been buried. Ellie was suing Richard Hammond personally for $50,000. It was the exact amount it had cost to bury her son and pay the appeal lawyers who had failed her, one after another for 12 years. The money didn't matter to her. She had already lost everything that mattered. She had sold the house she and her late husband Robert had bought in 1987 to pay for Daniel's first appeal. She had cashed in her teacher's pension early to pay for the second. She lived now in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. What she wanted, what she had come to Judge Faith's courtroom for, was for someone in a position of authority to look at the evidence and say out loud on camera that her son, Daniel Martinez, had been an innocent man. Every real court had refused to hear her case. 3 state attorneys had told her politely that the statute of limitations had run out. The Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice had sent her a form letter. 2 appellate judges who had served on the bench with Hammond had recused themselves and then recommended she let it go for her own peace of mind. A small town newspaper reporter in her county had written a 4-paragraph story about her in the local paper. A producer for Judge Faith's show had seen that story shared on social media, and 3 days later, Ellie's phone had rung. Meanwhile, the man she was suing, the man who had buried that affidavit 12 years ago, had just purchased a $2.8 million lake house in upstate New York, was paying $84,000 a year to send his daughter to Yale, drove a Lincoln Navigator with custom plates, and was being publicly vetted by the White House for a federal judgeship that would, if confirmed, place him beyond the reach of any state court for the rest of his life. Ellie sat in that chair with her trembling hands in her cardigan and her manila folder, and she believed she was completely alone. She believed she had one shot on television, in front of a judge she had never watched, against a man who had spent 30 years winning. What Ellie Martinez had no idea about, what nobody in that courtroom knew, except Judge Faith herself and a small handful of producers sworn to secrecy, was that Judge Faith had spent the previous 3 weekends quietly making phone calls to former assistant prosecutors who had resigned under pressure, to a retired homicide detective who had been pulled off 3 of Hammond's cases without explanation, to a forensic accountant who had been tracking unusual deposits into Hammond's offshore account for 2 years, and, most importantly, to one very nervous court clerk named Margaret Chen, a 71-year-old woman who had filed an internal complaint about Richard Hammond in 2007 and had been waiting 18 years for someone, anyone, to finally ask her to tell the truth. At exactly 9:14 that Tuesday morning, while Ellie Martinez sat in her plaintiff's chair, clutching her manila folder, a black Lincoln Navigator with tinted windows and government plates rolled up to the studio's back entrance. It was the lead vehicle of a two-car motorcade. The second SUV carried his aides, his prep team, and his personal attorney. The driver opened the rear door, and District Attorney Richard Hammond stepped out onto the pavement, already mid-sentence on his phone, his voice loud enough that the studio security guard 50 feet away could hear every word. "I don't care what the polling says. Coos, tell the governor I'll have his judicial recommendation on his desk by Friday, but he owes me on the Henderson case. Yeah, that's not my problem. Make it work." He didn't end the call so much as snap the phone shut with a kind of irritation reserved for people who have never been told no in their entire professional lives. Two aides hurried behind him carrying his briefcase, his garment bag, and a thermos of espresso he had insisted be flown in from a specific roaster in Manhattan. He didn't hold the door for anyone. He didn't make eye contact with the studio staff. He moved through the building like a man who owned it. He was 58 years old, okay? And he looked exactly like the kind of man who knew it. Silver hair swept back and held in place with a product his barber imported from Italy. Skin tanned to a permanent vacation bronze from weekends at his lake house. A tailored navy Brioni suit that had cost more than Ellie Martinez's monthly Social Security check. A crisp white shirt with mother-of-pearl buttons. A burgundy silk tie knotted in a perfect half Windsor. A small American flag lapel pin glinting on his left lapel. The irony of which would not be lost on the country within 48 hours. A solid gold Rolex Submariner on his left wrist, heavy enough that he had to adjust it when he sat down. And on his face, an expression that anyone who had ever stood in front of him in a courtroom would recognize instantly. The expression of a man for whom contempt was not an emotion, but a resting posture. His upper lip curled slightly whenever someone he considered beneath him began to speak, which in Richard Hammond's world was almost everyone. His resume was on paper, the kind of resume that politicians dreamed of. He had started as an assistant district attorney in 1995, the year after he graduated from law school. By 2003, he had been elected district attorney, running on a campaign so aggressively tough on crime that his opponent's family had requested police protection during the debates. He had held the office uninterrupted for the 22 years since a 94% conviction rate, the highest in the entire state and the second highest in the country. He had been profiled on 60 Minutes in 2018 under the title The Closer. He had been a keynote speaker at 3 national prosecutors' conventions. He had a wall in his office covered floor to ceiling with framed photographs of himself shaking hands with 3 sitting U.S. presidents, 2 Supreme Court justices, and the Attorney General of the United States. And in the past 6 months, his name had been formally entered into a White House shortlist, first for a federal judgeship, then quietly for the position of United States Attorney General. But underneath that polished surface, those who had worked closely with Richard Hammond had been whispering for years. 3 of his former assistant prosecutors had quietly resigned over what their exit interviews called ethics concerns. Concerns that had been sealed by non-disclosure agreements his office had required them to sign on their way out the door. 2 separate witnesses in 2 separate murder cases Hammond had personally tried had recanted their testimony in the years that followed. Both had told local reporters that they had been pressured, coached, or in one case, given a choice by Hammond himself. Neither of those cases had ever been reopened. And 4 years ago, a 33-year-old assistant district attorney named Sarah Patel had filed a formal internal complaint accusing Hammond of suppressing exculpatory evidence in a homicide case. The complaint had been quietly buried by the state bar. Sarah Patel had been fired 3 months later. She had been unable to find work in any prosecutor's office in the state since. He had not wanted to come to Judge Faith's courtroom. His legal team had begged him to settle. $50,000 was nothing. Pay it, sign the NDA, walk away. He had refused. He had refused loudly. He had told his attorney, a man who had represented him for 20 years and had never seen him hesitate, "I'll make an example of this woman. I'll teach America exactly what happens when somebody accuses a public servant of misconduct. The federal judgeship people will love it. They want a fighter. I'll give them a fighter on national television." His ego had calculated that a televised destruction of a grieving mother would be the perfect audition tape. He believed, with the kind of belief that only 30 years of unbroken winning can produce, that he could humiliate Eleanor Martinez in front of 12 million viewers and walk out a hero. Backstage that morning, his arrogance was almost theatrical. He refused to shake hands with the senior producer who came to greet him. Gesticulating vaguely at the bottle of hand sanitizer his aide was carrying, he told the makeup artist who approached him with a foundation brush, without looking up from his phone, "Don't bother, the camera loves me." He told his personal attorney just before they walked toward the studio doors, with a small dismissive laugh that the makeup artist would later describe to a reporter, "Relax, this judge is a TV character. I've prosecuted murderers. I'll bury this old woman in 5 minutes." What Richard Hammond did not know, what no amount of opposition research, no amount of polling, no amount of 30 years of crushing opponents had prepared him to understand, was that the woman waiting for him on the other side of those studio doors was not a television character. Judge Faith had spent 32 years in the courtroom bench before a television camera had ever pointed in her direction. She had personally adjudicated more than 20,000 cases. She had prosecuted men exactly like Richard Hammond, men with gold watches and contempt-curled lips, and the absolute certainty that their power made them invisible. And she had broken every single one of them. And sitting on her desk that morning, beside her water glass and her reading glasses, was a thick manila folder containing the work product of 6 months of quiet, patient, surgical investigation. A folder that was about to end Richard Hammond's entire life. The case was scheduled for 10 minutes. It would last 23, and every single second of it would be replayed on the news every hour on the hour for the next 2 weeks. The studio doors opened at exactly 9:58 that morning. The cameras began rolling. Ellie Martinez was already seated at the plaintiff's table, her gray cardigan buttoned all the way to the top, her manila folder placed neatly in front of her, her hands folded over the folder to keep them from shaking visibly on camera. She had been there for almost 2 hours. She had not eaten breakfast. She had not slept the night before. She kept her eyes fixed on the wood grain of the table because she was afraid that if she looked up, she would start crying before the hearing even began. The audience filed in quietly, settling into their seats with a slightly nervous excitement of people who knew somehow that this was going to be a different kind of episode. Then the side door swung open and Richard Hammond strode into the courtroom like he owned the building. He didn't walk, he paraded. He took the entire room in with one sweeping glance, the way a man inspects a property he is considering purchasing. He did not look at Ellie. He did not acknowledge her existence. He sat down at the defendant's table, leaned over to his personal attorney, and said loudly enough that the boom mic clearly captured every word, "Tell Marcus I'll make the tea time Saturday, but I'm not playing with that idiot from Goldman again. Last time, he 4-putted on 7 and tried to charge me for lunch." His attorney shifted uncomfortably and said something quiet about not discussing it now. Hammond laughed a short, sharp, dismissive laugh and checked his Rolex. Judge Faith was already at the bench. She had been at the bench for the entire 2 minutes since the cameras began rolling. She had not said a single word. She was watching him. The veteran courtroom regulars who had been in that audience hundreds of times before, the retirees who had been watching her show for 25 years, recognized the look immediately. Her chin was tilted slightly down. Her reading glasses were resting on the bridge of her nose. Her hands were folded on the bench in front of her, and her eyes, narrowed just slightly behind those glasses, were tracking every movement Richard Hammond made. She watched him sit down. She watched him laugh about his golf game. She watched him check his Rolex a second time. She watched him whisper something to his attorney that made his attorney close his eyes, and she did not move. 11 full seconds passed. 11 seconds of complete silence in a television courtroom while America's most respected judge studied her prey. The camera caught a single audience member, an older woman in a red blouse, third row, aisle seat, slowly leaning forward in her chair. She knew. The veterans always knew. Something was about to happen. Judge Faith finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational. Mr. Hammond, you do understand that this is a small claims court, correct? Hammond didn't even look up from his phone for a full 2 seconds. When he finally raised his eyes to meet hers, he was smirking, the smirk of a man who had been waiting all morning for this exact moment. He leaned back in his chair, spread his hands slightly, and said, "Your Honor, with all due respect, I understand more about courtrooms than you will see in a lifetime of television." The audience gasped. It wasn't a polite theatrical gasp. It was an involuntary, sucked-in breath that came from 30 people at the same time. The camera caught a man in the second row whose mouth literally fell open and stayed open. Hammond's own attorney, the man who had represented him for 20 years, lowered his head and pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose. Ellie Martinez looked up for the first time, and what she saw on Judge Faith's face made her grip the edges of her folder a little tighter, because Judge Faith was smiling, just slightly. The smile that regular viewers had learned over decades was the most dangerous expression in daytime television. Judge Faith did not respond to him, not yet. She simply turned her attention to Ellie. "Mrs. Martinez, please tell me in your own words why you are here today." Ellie's voice came out smaller than she had practiced. She had to clear her throat twice, but she told the story. She told it the way she had told it to herself 1,000 times in the dark the night Daniel didn't come home. The day they came to the apartment with the arrest warrant, the trial that lasted for days, the 12 years of letters, the appeals, the Thursday morning in October when the prison called her at 6:47 in the morning. Her voice broke when she said her son's name out loud. She slid the recanted witness statement across the table. She slid the medical records that showed 3 months of denied request for a routine surgery. She slid the affidavit from the store owner with Richard Hammond's office's date stamp clearly visible on the corner. She did not look at Hammond. She could not look at him. She was afraid that if she looked at him, she would lose the dignity she had spent 18 months rebuilding. While Ellie spoke, while a 64-year-old widow recounted on national television the worst 12 years of her life, Richard Hammond rolled his eyes. He rolled them slowly, theatrically, twice. He leaned over to his attorney and whispered something with a small, amused laugh. He checked his Rolex for the third time in 7 minutes. And then, when Ellie reached the part of her testimony where she described the call from the prison, the call that told her her only son was dead, Richard Hammond yawned. Not a small accidental yawn, a long, audible, performative yawn. He stretched his arms slightly. He didn't bother to cover his mouth. Judge Faith's gavel did not move. Her voice did. It dropped a full octave. Mr. Hammond, if you sigh in my courtroom one more time, if you yawn, if you check that watch, if you so much as breathe loudly while this woman is testifying, you will spend the rest of this hearing on your feet. Are we clear? The courtroom went silent. Hammond's smirk faltered for the first time, but only for a second, because Richard Hammond had been winning fights like this for 30 years, and his ego would not let him sit down quietly. He pushed his chair back, leaned forward over the defendant's table, and went on the offensive. Your Honor, with respect, this is a frivolous case brought by a grieving mother who refuses to accept that her son was a criminal. I have done nothing wrong. I will not be put on trial in a small claims court for doing my job. This case should not even be in your courtroom. I am, with respect, the only person in this room who actually understands the law. He said with respect twice. Judge Faith heard it both times. She heard the condescension in it. She heard the contempt buried inside the word respect. The way Hammond had used the same word twice, the way a man swings a hammer twice to drive in a nail. She did not respond immediately. She leaned back in her chair, she set down her pen, she folded her hands, and then she smiled. Not the warm smile, the other one. The slight, almost amused smile that was the last thing thousands of defendants had ever seen before. Their lives had come apart in her courtroom. Richard Hammond had just done the one thing that every experienced trial attorney in America knew you must never, ever do in front of Judge Faith. He had underestimated the woman in the robe, and in less than 4 minutes, he would point his finger at her and say the 7 words that would end his 30-year career. Judge Faith reached for the manila folder on her desk, but she didn't open it. Not yet. She rested her hand on top of it the way a poker player rests her hand on a card she hasn't played yet, and she turned her full attention to Richard Hammond. Her voice was quiet now, almost gentle. Anyone who had watched her show for more than a season knew that gentle was the most dangerous register her voice could possibly enter. Mr. Hammond, I have a few questions for you. Let's start with something simple. On the morning of June 14th, 2013, 14 days before Daniel Martinez's trial began, your office received a sworn affidavit from a man named Vincent Reyes, the owner of the convenience store where the robbery took place. In that affidavit, Mr. Reyes stated under oath that he had been mistaken in his identification of Daniel Martinez. Are you familiar with this document? Hammond's smirk had reduced itself to a flat line. He adjusted his tie. Your Honor, I prosecute hundreds of cases. I don't recall every detail of a case from 12 years ago. Judge Faith did not blink. Then maybe you shouldn't have prosecuted it. A small, sharp laugh escaped from somewhere in the audience and was immediately swallowed by silence. Hammond's jaw tightened. His attorney leaned over and whispered something urgently into his ear. Hammond brushed him off without looking. Judge Faith continued. Mr. Hammond, the affidavit has a date stamp from your office, June 14th, 2013, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Your initials are on the intake log. Daniel Martinez's defense attorney has stated in 3 separate appellate filings over 12 years that this document was never disclosed to him. Can you tell me why? Hammond shifted in his chair. The Rolex caught the light. Your Honor, I cannot speak to the document handling procedures of my office from over a decade ago. There are protocols, there are clerks, there are intake officers. Judge Faith nodded slowly, the way a teacher nods at a student who is just given the wrong answer on purpose. So, your testimony under oath is that you, the district attorney who personally tried this case, who delivered the closing argument, who stood in front of the jury and asked them to send a 19-year-old college student to prison for 25 years, you have no memory of an exculpatory affidavit that arrived in your office 2 weeks before that trial began. Hammond's voice rose slightly. Your Honor, I object to the framing of this question. Judge Faith did not look up from her notes. This is small claims court, Mr. Hammond. You don't get to object. You answer. The audience was leaning forward now, all of them. Ellie Martinez had not moved a muscle. Her hands were folded so tightly that the knuckles had gone white. Hammond glanced at his attorney one more time. His attorney was no longer trying to coach him. His attorney was staring straight ahead at the wall behind Judge Faith's bench. It's the way a man stares at a wall when he can already see the end of his client's career. Judge Faith pressed forward. Let me ask you another question. Mr. Hammond, Daniel Martinez's defense attorney, a public defender named Howard Klein, has gone on the record stating that he requested all Brady material from your office on 3 separate occasions. He has stated in a sworn affidavit submitted to the Bar Association that he was told no such material existed. Is that statement true or false? Hammond's face was beginning to flush. The bronze tan was being overwritten by a slow rising red. Your Honor, Howard Klein has been making allegations against my office for years. He is a disgruntled former public defender who couldn't handle the workload. Judge Faith's pen paused. Mr. Klein has been a public defender for 31 years, Mr. Hammond. He has tried over 400 cases. He retired last September with a Lifetime Achievement Award from the State Bar Association. Would you like to revise your characterization of him? Hammond's hands were now flat on the table. He was no longer leaning back. He had leaned forward. His voice took on a new quality. The tight, controlled, just barely restrained voice of a man who is used to giving orders, not answering questions. Your Honor, I want to remind this court, and I want to remind you personally, that I am a sitting district attorney of one of the largest counties in this state. I have prosecuted thousands of cases. My professional reputation is, at this very moment, being attacked by an emotional woman with no evidence in a small claims court on a television show. Judge Faith let the silence hang for a beat. Then she said evenly, she has the witness statement that you buried, Mr. Hammond, with your office's date stamp on it, with your initials on the intake log. That is evidence. And in my courtroom, that is evidence enough for me. Something inside Richard Hammond broke. 30 years of unbroken winning. 30 years of nobody, not a defense attorney, not a journalist, not a single one of his subordinates ever speaking to him this way. 30 years of cultivated invincibility cracked open in a single moment. His face went from red to a deep mottled crimson. He stood up. He stood up so fast that the chair scraped backward across the studio floor, and his personal attorney's hand shot out reflexively to grab his sleeve. Hammond shook him off. He pointed his finger directly at Judge Faith, a sitting district attorney on national television, pointing his index finger across a courtroom at the most respected judge in America. And he said the 7 words that would end his entire life. You should be very careful, Judge Faith. Then he didn't stop. The thing about men like Richard Hammond is that once the dam breaks, the entire flood comes out. I have friends in places you can't even imagine. I will personally make sure this episode never airs. I will have my legal team file a defamation suit against this show, against this network, and against you personally before sundown. I will make sure every advertiser on this program is reviewing their contracts by tomorrow morning. I've spent 30 years building relationships with people who could end your career with a single phone call. You are playing with fire, Judge, and you do not know who you are dealing with. The courtroom did not just freeze, it died. There is no other word for it. Every sound, every movement, every breath stopped at the same instant. The audience did not gasp this time. They were past gasping. They were silent. A woman in the front row put both of her hands over her mouth and kept them there. Ellie Martinez closed her eyes. Hammond's personal attorney did not put his head in his hands. He put his entire face in his hands, and his shoulders sagged with the unmistakable posture of a man who had just watched a 20-year client commit professional suicide in front of 12 million people. The bailiff, a former Marine named Charles Whitaker, who had stood beside Judge Faith's bench for 9 years, took one small but unmistakable step forward. The camera operators, every single one of them, kept rolling because they all understood in real time that they were capturing something that had never happened before in the history of daytime television. A sitting district attorney of the United States had just threatened a federal-level television judge on her own bench, on her own show, with cameras rolling and an audience of millions watching live. Judge Faith did not move. Her hands remained folded on top of the manila folder. Her eyes remained fixed on Richard Hammond. She did not blink. She did not flinch. She did not respond. 1 second passed. 2, 3. The cameras pushed in tight on her face, then cut to Hammond, then back to her. 4 seconds. 5, 6. Hammond, still standing, still with his finger pointed, began to feel, for the first time in 30 years, the very edges of doubt. His finger lowered slightly. His chest, which had been puffed out in righteous fury, settled back to a normal position. 7 seconds. 8. And in that 8th second of complete suffocating silence, Richard Hammond began to understand, slowly, the way a man understands he has stepped on a landmine only after he has already heard the click, that he had just made a catastrophic mistake. If you're as shocked as that courtroom audience right now, smash that like button. Tell me in the comments, should a sitting district attorney be allowed to threaten a judge on national television? Should men like Richard Hammond be allowed to hide behind their titles and badges when grieving mothers come asking for the truth? Drop your thoughts below. Subscribe right now and hit the notification bell, because what Judge Faith does in the next 60 seconds will go down as the single greatest moment in courtroom television history. Trust me, you will not believe the 12 words that follow. You will not believe what she pulls out of that manila folder. Judge Faith reached forward and she opened the manila folder. Judge Faith leaned forward and spoke 12 words that would change everything. Mr. Hammond, I've been waiting 6 months to say this on camera. The folder opened. Margaret Chen's buried complaint from 2007. The Innocence Project's list of 47 suppressed cases. Bank records showing $340,000 from a private prison contractor. A photograph of Hammond golfing with the appellate judge who denied Daniel's appeals. Then Daniel's handwritten letter read aloud. Hammond's face went pale. Judge Faith ruled $50,000 to Ellie. Documents sent to the FBI, State Bar, and Attorney General. You came in threatening to end my career. Instead, you ended yours. Get out. 11 million views overnight. Hashtag Faith Destroyed Day trended for 11 days. Within 48 hours, the FBI opened a review and Hammond's judgeship nomination was indefinitely paused. 3 former prosecutors came forward. His wife of 28 years filed for divorce, saying, "I didn't know the man I was married to." Within 90 days, 18 wrongfully convicted men walked free, and Daniel Martinez was posthumously exonerated. Hammond was indicted on 23 counts, pleaded guilty to 9, and sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. On his first day inside, a guard told him, "Welcome to the system, Mr. Hammond. We've heard about you." 2 years later, asked which case mattered most, Judge Faith smiled softly. Eleanor Martinez. She reminded me why I put on the robe. Ellie placed Daniel's exoneration certificate at his headstone beside his college acceptance letter. Hammond believed power was a shield. He learned truth is a weapon. If this moved you, smash that like button, subscribe and hit the bell. Comment justice for Daniel if his story deserves to be remembered. Share with someone who needs hope, because in Judge Faith's courtroom, no badge protects you from a judge who isn't afraid of you. The truth always finds home.